And I think he recommended it to me initially when I was 15. And the issue that was on the racks at that point was the Dave McKean issue. And I think I was a Vertigo reader at the time. So he thought, okay, well, maybe this is, maybe Austin this will be a good issue for him to try it. And I remember picking it up. And at 15, it was too advanced. I might have been younger then. Whenever that Dave McKean cover issue came out, I just couldn't make heads or tails of it. But for whatever happened in the next couple of years, I believe the first issue I sat down and read from cover to cover was the Garth Ennis, Bob Fingerman issue, and that came and I probably read that issue more closely than any issue I've read since, honestly, because it was so, at that age I had been immersed in comics since I was 10 and obsessed with them and trying to piece together what they meant for me. And here was a magazine where, more so than anyone in my private life, which, I think most people's interest in comics had kind of faded away at that point in terms of friends that I had, I would look at letters pages in magazines that I liked and try to understand what was happening in the industry or what people were thinking about it through letters pages. But when I read that issue of the Comics Journal, it was like, okay, well, these people are thinking about these things more intensely than I am, and all their reference points are on a different register. And but the heart of what they're referencing syncs up with what I think, but all the beats are different. And I remember I think in that issue there was some comment about Linda Medley's Castle Waiting, which at the time I really, really loved. And I just remember reading that sentence over and over again because I couldn't tell if it was dismissive of Castle Waiting or if it was saying, and it was just so, I started, the respect I felt for this magazine's intensity was so great that when something that I was aware of, like Castle Waiting, was mentioned, I needed to cycle through, is this challenging something that I really, really love? So then coming to the top 100 issue, probably just maybe 6 months later, it was just the right time,
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I had the same sort of experience. My first issue of the Journal was number 148, Charles Burns. I don't know how old I was, but I wasn't at all prepared for that. I mean, when you've only seen Wizard and Comics Values Monthly and
right.
and that comic scene, stuff like that, I just wasn't prepared for people writing so seriously for an adult readership.
Yeah.
So I don't know quite when I settled back in, probably somewhere during the Tom Spurgeon era, which is, the issue that we're about to talk about. That, of course, is the capstone of his TCJ career.
Yeah, the last one. Yeah.
The last one. Yeah. It's an amazing choice by him to go out on that kind of high. I'm going to backtrack real fast and introduce you. I'm speaking to Austin English today, co-editor of the Comics Journal, proprietor of Domino Books. Can be found at dominobooks.org. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. And teacher, publisher, and polemicist, I believe, is the other term.
Yeah, that's just a joke that I have up there.
I know. I just listened to the podcast you did with Miami Review of Comics with Drew Lerman.
Yeah.
Fantastic episode. You guys talking about Saul Steinberg. Drew Lerman's great at that. Yeah, he sounds like a pro. So,
no, he did good.
Yeah,
and
no,
that was funny because that Saul Steinberg, the first time I became aware of Saul Steinberg was from this issue of the Comics Journal. And it was just the drawing included. I wish I had the 99 top 100 list in front of me, but the drawing that they used for Saul Steinberg just I just really connected with it. And that this kind of, I just become aware of things like John Porcelino's King Cat. And so, yes,
Yeah,
there it
you
is.
go. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and that might have been the biggest effect for me from the list, that whatever ambitions I had for what comics can do, seeing that drawing sort of communicated something that I knew to be true about what comics can do, but could not articulate at the time in my own words. And I was not aware of Steinberg. I was aware of a lot of New Yorker cartoonists, but not him at that moment. And so that was really I just remember the jolt of energy I got from not just seeing this drawing in an article, but seeing it on this list where I was aware of some of the work, not aware a lot of it, and just that image really burning itself into my brain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know that I had quite this awakening with individual works, but I will say that I've had the same effect in terms of the image used is what I think of when I think of a specific work, like the panel they use from Stuck Rubber Baby by Howard Cruz. That's what I immediately think of. If you say that title, I just think of that panel. So yeah, this like same with you. A lot of these titles I wasn't aware of, or I was aware of them, but I'd never seen them anywhere. And so these became kind of a totem, for me.
In your research on this issue, sometimes if I'm doing research on something and I want to just kind of assess like what the consensus of, I was recently like, what is just a general list of what people think the best 70s manga is, just for something I'm working on. I just kind of wanted to see what the general feeling was. And you go on websites that, it's the line between whether a human is working on this and some kind of AI generated thing. It's very hard to tell these days. And of course, the images that are pulled are just cover images. And in your research, if you found who was doing the production work, I mean, maybe it's just listed in the credits and that would be who did it, but they did a fabulous job of pulling the panels for each entry. I don't believe there's just a simple cover image on any of them,
No, they pulled out a representative panel or image from everything.
They pulled out some cartooning from each of them.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, in some cases you actually get, like for Polly and her pals, you get, like a full Sunday strip.
Right.
Which is a great amount of, I mean, here's a zippy, there's a 3-panel strip, they give you a full thing. And that's for one of the smaller entries, it's not a full page entry or something.
I remember the Crumb sketchbook images. I looked at those because I had read some Crumb at that point. But I had not seen the sketchbooks I'd seen them in the movie, but the idea that there was this great wealth of them that might be in print or might have been published at that point was really exciting. And the images that are included with those Crumb sketchbooks, I really, really looked at. And so, I mean, everything in there, I really poured over the images. So,
yeah. Did you make an effort to search out these works after the list?
I think I was on a teenager's budget and was definitely would make some key selections around Christmas time and tried to, but I think maybe this is something you discovered in your work on this, but I think really one of the noble things about the list is that it's hard to say how influential the list was in getting a lot of this work republished, but so much of it was not available. I think if you made the list now, and this might not be the one that the editors would be the most excited about, but Jack Kirby's Fourth World work was just in these kind of like black and white reproductions, and I had looked at some of those, I think in a library, and just kind of felt like it was, some flawed, maybe had some merit by some kind of like complicated logic or something like, oh, this is like a twisted kind of vision that this person couldn't get all the way to, but there's some merit there. And when that work was published in a kind of lucky coincidence on that nice newsprint paper, I think the fact, I mean, I wouldn't credit the TCJ list for why it's in print now, but there's so much key work that was just unavailable at the time in 1999. I remember one of my early experiences with cartooning is my mom had a friend who ran a used bookstore, and he had a real passion for art cartooning. And, as a bookseller, he was very interested in used editions of Crazy Cat and things like that. And he commissioned her to draw the sandwich board for his used bookshop. And he asked her to draw some Crazy Cat figures. And this is around when I was 4. So I remember seeing those books in the house. She was using them as reference for her sandwich board. And so I would look at those books. I wasn't able to read them, but I would look at them. And so I had this, and I would see them around, after that, and try to study them and enjoy them as much as I could. But I did not have a full book of Crazy Cat at that time. And it was this kind of thing that, like, when that first Fantagraphics edition that came out pretty soon after this list, I believe the Chris Ware edited ones, which I still think are great volumes. I just remember being really, really, it was tantalizing having those collections come out, especially after the list had kind of validated something I felt about it. But yes, seeking out the work that was on there, I think I tried my best, to look around for what I could. But yeah, I mean, it was definitely, but then, you have the reaction where you don't want to have too much allegiance to something, because at the time, and this remains true today, even though I've worked on these yearbook things for the Comics Journal, where we try to do a consensus list of the best books of the year, I don't believe in lists. I think they're bad. I do think they're anti-art, but I do also think they're important. And at the time, I was reading this top 100 list, and I when it came out, and I did think, well, this isn't what art is about, and this doesn't make, I want my influenceable mind to not to do this hierarchical thing where Crazy Cat is better than Kim Deitch or something. That's silly. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But the value of thinking about it and thinking about, I could sense the value of that, But in terms of seeking things out, just because it's on the list, yeah, I definitely felt like if I saw something around and it was affordable that was on the list that I wasn't aware of, I did feel the impulse to get it because it was on the list for my own education. But I also wanted to not, to make how I've always kind of approached cartooning, things that I just see that I'm unaware of out in the wild that have no context, and allowing myself to come to those things, mini comics that I haven't heard anyone talk about that I connect with, to not push those aside and say, oh, well, this was on the list, I have to study this first, So for me, it's a big balancing act. The value of these things, of lists like this, which I do think are very legitimate, but not to confuse them with a higher morality, I guess, even though they're deeply important to me. Do you know what I mean?
I do. Yeah, I mean, I love lists of all kinds. But I also generally I don't take them very seriously. I look at them as, obviously it depends on who's putting a list together, or how authoritative the individual or the organization is.
Yeah.
When it came to the journal doing a list, I thought, I'm taking this really seriously because it's the journal. But I also was humbled enough by the list to know that I didn't know enough, to say,
Right.
well, I mean, how the hell would I know about the Bungle family, So I can't say whether it's better than Dark Knight Returns or not. I haven't read the Bungle family, when
Right.
the age I'm encountering the list, but
Allowing your mind to unite the two, I think that was a power of the list. Like, okay,
yes,
Bungle family's on here, Watchmen is on here. What is that? Um, Hirschfeld's on here, Steinberg's on here. What does that mean in terms of how you can think about this medium that you're obsessed with? I think that's the education of it, and the mind debate you go through, and the arguing. I think in is that's the value.
I agree. And I really think, a lot of people, like the Canon annual, I print that thing from a message board,
Mm.
where the people argue, and they're kind of criticizing it. Some people, before they've even seen the list, they're criticizing it. And one of the main criticisms was that all these different kinds of comics were melded together, and they should have separated strips, and they should have done this.
Yeah.
But I think that was the genius of it. And I don't know that they even knew that it was going to be genius. Kim Thompson kind of says, "Oh, I'm surprised this worked, but it works really well." Throwing all of these things together, it really enriches the whole.
That's something I still hear from people in my life, people who love comics that are deeply knowledgeable about them, or really, immersed in them. I still hear from people say there's too many single panel strips on there. There's too much of, there's too much of this, there's too much New Yorker cartooning on there, or there's too many strips, or whatever. More that there's too much single panel stuff, and that shouldn't be on there. And these are people who in any other respect, I consider deeply progressive in their view on the medium. And I'm always surprised because I had I found that very liberating, because McCloud's definitions, which were, I think, still very much in the air at this time, and still are, I appreciated what McCloud was doing, even reading it when it came out, but I did not, the amount of notes and reasoning to exclude single panel cartooning felt like kind of a lady doth protest too much kind of thing, where it's like there's too much math going on here to explain why these aren't cartooning than just how obviously in line they are with cartooning. A drawing that makes a statement either aided by text or not, that has some kind of narrative to it, and maybe you could say has some kind of line work and mass reproduction. I don't know, that seems closer. James Thurber seems closer to George Harriman than I don't know, some kind of digitally colored Warren Ellis Stormwatch comic. And I'm not going to exclude that Warren Ellis Stormwatch comic as part of cartooning. Why am I going to exclude Saul Steinberg or something like that? It does seem, but anyway, yeah, it was extremely liberating to see that work in the list. And I think people like Shel Silverstein, and he's not on the list, but Edward Lear, I think comics loves to disconnect itself from some of the people who really did genius things with it, like some of the people who really made work with line work, or made work that was made in concert with text, and tries to just narrow us down. And this list kind of suggested a lot of different avenues, and I think in a really, direct, succinct way.
Yeah, I agree. In general, I'm a big tent guy when it comes to comics. I mean, if it's, I'll accept a lot of definitions, and in fact, I just don't really believe in the definitions. It's funny you mentioning McCloud, though. I mean, you're right. That was right in the thick of it. I mean, a few issues away from that issue is when they did the McCloud roundtable.
Oh, I need that one again. I don't have it anymore.
Yeah, and so it really shows you what was in the air. That that was a big deal. And I know nowadays it's kind of become fashionable to poo-poo McCloud. But I think once again it was important just to get people talking and to get the error is that people think they can define something that's indefinable, and McCloud falls into that as well. But he did achieve the goal of getting a lot of people to talk about stuff, and probably now more sophisticated people have come along and had more to say. But I think he contributed something pretty valuable.
He did, yeah. I mean, I can't deny that. Again, I probably came to it sooner than I should have to really appreciate it. But I think, when did that come out? I think I read it a year after it came out, and I didn't, of course, could not fully understand it. But I must have been like 11 years old or something. But I did. There are things that probably. Yeah, I mean, there's attitudes. I think it was the first place I heard about Dada, because he uses that in the book, and I had to like look up what that was, and so it gave a lot. There was a lot in there, and it really was kind of, there was this electric feeling to watching someone explain this argument. But I kind of worry that the effect it had on my younger brain, if I could process any of those arguments at all, then kind of points to maybe that maybe some problems that it might have in terms of it being a mature argument that has I teach a class at SVA called Comics Criticism, and it's supposed to be about just examining ways to talk about comics and what comics can do. And the professor who taught this class before me, the first 5 weeks would be like breaking down things from McCloud. And I just prefer not to use McCloud at all, because I do think just showing people work, what I'll do is on the first couple of weeks, I'll just show them, I'll read them a lot of comics from different, the way McCloud shows different ways the medium can present itself. I'll just read this work to them and kind of then build discussions, and we'll talk about the differences. And I do think McCloud reveals a way to look at things a little too tightly, and I should look at it again. It's been so long. It would be good to really engage with it again. But I felt more energized by this list than I felt by McCloud. I look back at this list so much more, and it's because it's the work, and it's engaging with the work directly. But I love theories about stuff, so maybe that's kind of contradicting what I really believe. But yeah. But I do that. Yeah, the proof is there that I look back at this list all the time, and I don't really look back at understanding comics.
Yeah, that was that was one of the questions I wanted to ask, and you've just answered it. That you do revisit this list. It's funny, almost everyone I talked to has said no.
Oh,
including all the people who worked on it. So you and I are in a very small club.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't. I guess, yeah, that makes me feel silly. But the people who worked on it are probably sick of it. No, I do look back on it partly just because to see what's changed. I'm interested in how attitudes about comics change, and in the years that I've probably been really immersed in this stuff as someone interacting with it since I think I started writing little reviews about things and corresponding with people and having friendships in comics with artists probably around 1997. And I've always had a certain view of what comics can withstand, and maybe what their true potential is in this country. It's probably, their potential has, I think, probably been more fully realized in other countries. I'd say more Japan than anywhere else. When I look at work that comes out of there, I really don't know what my kind of project, what worth it would have there, because I think a more sophisticated, less labored sophistication exists there. A more poetic view of the medium exists on the edges because there's such a strong center. But I am always very interested in where what the potential for people engaging with comics can be, and complicated material having more, a more direct relationship with readers, and then what that can do in the world, the world at large, what I think serious, complicated work that has something to say with this medium. I do think there's a role there. I think comics that engage with things in a real way, I think there's some effect they can have on culture, politics, people's lives that are different than the effect that film and literature have had. And I do not think that has been, I don't think that's happened really. I think it can happen. And so seeing how this country's sometimes progressive view and sometimes going backwards from some degree of progressivism, I'm always fascinated by the ebbs and flows. And I think this list kind of gets at and I think what's talked about in your annual is kind of how a lot of people thought of it as like, this is a first stab at building some kind of consensus. And again, I think people are very correct. They're like, we're not trying to be authoritative with this, but we're trying to build something here and see what happens. I think a lot of political projects get misunderstood as like having an end goal when the political project reaches realization. And it's really what happens after, how do people react once we've built this thing, this kind of, if it's some kind of equality or some kind of movement, if it can have effect, it doesn't end there. What happens after that? And I do think this list is kind of like, okay, what do we do from here? And so I like to look back at it and say, okay, well, where did things go from here? And of course, so many other things were happening simultaneously that you can't chart changes in the whole ecosystem just from this list. But yeah, I mean, I do try to think about, and it's partly because of a project I'm engaged in, what people would accept now from this list, and what would change, and what that means about, not just, I'm not so interested in just like aesthetic arguments that the list makes or aesthetic arguments about comics in general. I'm more interested in ideas that comics express and what those ideas can do outside of the world of comics. And I do think often comics, verges on received ideas within the medium itself. And I like to see where they can go beyond that. And there's a lot of work on this list that goes beyond our hermetic definitions of what art can be, but a lot that doesn't too. I mean, in a way, it's a very conservative list, which I think is good for its relevance and why it had to be considered by a very conservative community of people, the comics world. I think it did a good job of having some radicalism in it, in a kind of airtight, otherwise progressive conservatism, so that people could like access it, not dismiss it totally. And I think that's good, but I also don't want to dismiss that there are things in it that present a very kind of specific view of what comics can be. Sorry, that was a lot of a lot of different threads there.
No, that's great. I talked to someone earlier today about some of these issues that you bring up, and he was making the point. I'll say his name. His name is Robert Boyd, who
he's great.
one of the list makers, and he was making the point that so much good work has been done in the last 50 years, which would take you through the last quarter century of the 20th century, and then the last 25 years of this century,
right?
Or the only 25 years of the century. That a new list would be radically different. But when they were making the list in '99, of course, they had 75 years before that stretching out that they were engaged with, and of course, some of those revolutions maybe hadn't gotten to them yet. If that makes sense. I mean, we think of some things now as being like Acme Novelty Library has been around more than 30 years, but at the time it was just a few years old. So putting it as high on the list as they did seemed pretty bold to me at the time. But it's the sort of thing where you're like, oh, it makes sense that they would rank it that highly. Then they were so charged up by it. And meanwhile, some of the older works, the Bungle family, and some of these would probably fall off because they're now so far removed that as many people haven't read them. It's not that the work has gotten worse. It's just that if fewer and fewer people engage with something, it's harder to keep it in any kind of collective memory.
Well, I guess my feeling about like the conservative versus progressive nature of the list, where it's like, I'm not so, I don't look at the 99 list and think that more work from the 90s and 80s needs to be on it necessarily. And I know that's not what you're saying. But if it was to be redone, I'm not so, even if there is work that I think has been more important to me in the last 25 years, I still think it's too, I just have a hard time for all time thinking of work in my lifetime, kind of assessing it as, I feel like I still need for work in the 2010s. I still need like another decade for it to really sink in with me. I'm more interested in, if the list was to be done today, how works from the past, as things change, how that changes our perception of works from the past. I mean, the one that I and this is just like a gut reaction, Peter Arno being number 21 on here. I don't and there's nothing wrong with Peter Arno. It's very talented. He's such a craftsman, impeccable. But I think there's been enough work. I mean, Peter Arno's so in line with the world as it is, and just a kind of like, and again, there's nothing wrong with that either, but there's a shallowness to the work that I think comics people excuse because of the sheer craft involved, like the professionalism of it. And that feels like a statement where it's like, well, Peter Arno's on here because you guys think John Byrne is a craftsman. This is a craftsman. Okay. That's the criticism here. But I don't think I feel like craft as the main arbiter of criticizing lower standards in comics. I think that's a shift I'd see when looking at the past. Peter Arno's importance on that level, I think, should be reduced. Not that craft becomes unimportant, but I don't. Yeah, I mean, I think I see attitudes. I think if you look at work influenced by John Porcellino and work that has a different kind of craft becoming easier for people in comics mind, people to accept. I think that's how you might see an attitude of the last 20 years, not necessarily in the work itself from the last 20 years, making it onto a list, but influencing our ideas about the past.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I always took Arno's. Well, one, I was always surprised by Arno's high ranking too, and I like Arno. I like the New Yorker cartoonists. Just the older ones, in general, and I like his work. I didn't know why he was ranked so much higher than Charles Adams, Steinberg. Is it Booth? Is it George Booth that's on the list?
Is Booth on the list? Wow. Okay, that's good.
I think he's 96.
Okay, I'd bring him. I mean, if like George Booth, I wouldn't be shocked if someone was like, he's at best he'll be at number 90 for me. But for me personally, I just think there's something so. If I could be any cartoonist, and I don't make work like George Booth at all, the way that he just is able to write with these, like these ink drawings he does are just, they're so free, but they're so exact, and he's just able to, they're so alive, and he's done the same kind of subject matter with these dogs over and over again, but they always remain electric. The gags are funny, but it's just this way of writing thought. It's not like Steinberg with thought, but it's like this way of writing like text with imagery that's just perfect. So he'd be really high up for me, but I could understand him I mean, I think him in the 90s makes sense.
Yeah.
Let me see
I actually misspoke. It's George Price that's on the list.
Okay. See,
Not
there you
George
go.
Bernard.
That makes more sense.
Yeah.
George Price,
But
I would. I might
yeah.
86 George Price personally.
Yeah.
That's very like genteel kind
Yeah.
of. I can understand that. To me is the same Arno logic where it's like we need to. These guys are really knew how to draw, and they were sophisticated, and they had this wit to them, and let's celebrate that. And yeah, I wouldn't. George Price, I don't think would still register for me.
Yeah. I like both. I like both the Georges. But it still begs the question, why is Peter Arno 60 spots ahead? Or,
There's a
I
cultural
just assumed
attitude.
it was some sort of New Yorker. I just assumed it was some sort of New Yorker halo effect, right? That they're so respectable, they were so successful. But yeah, Arno's an outlier by being so high up, and I just couldn't even imagine him being. I don't know if he would make a list now, but I certainly don't know that he would make a list. He wouldn't make a list that high. There's just no way.
It's like, and also like, Crumb has, there's all these accusations of Crumb and sexism and racism. And I don't even think I value Crumb highly. And if I was to make a list now, he'd be in, maybe a couple entries on my top 20 at least. But I think he's beyond racist and sexist. And I think you have to confront that about him. But there's something about Arno's sexism that I'm a little more repulsed by because it's so boring. Like, at least Crumb sexism comes from a place of obsession, and it's just more interesting to me, even if I'm not I don't think those attitudes should just be like, oh, it's just lines on paper, he's just expressing himself. I do think there's more, it's darker than that, but it is much more it's a more artistic kind of expression of something that I'm not in line with, and it's much more moving. Whereas Arno sexism is it's just so it's just kind of a received idea of sexism, so
yeah, Crumb's is it's psychological, and Arno's is just societal. It's just
right, exactly.
I mean, it's the stuff. It's just you would have gotten that from anyone back then. It's just Arno was maybe better at it. He was better at the gag, delivering the gag. He was better at it than a lot of other people were. But it's the same gag you would have gotten in any number of magazines from any number of journeyman cartoonists.
Yeah, in a way, it's kind of worse with him because he like cleaned it up and made it less kind of like waspy sort of kind of this just that tone, that sort of like John Cheever tone, which I mean he's of a different era, but it just has that kind of there's something about it but yeah, I mean he is a to say that it's just his craft. I mean there is a real sophistication to what he does that is valuable. But yeah, I'd see that being one that's that would switch around for sure.
Yeah. I'm going to reference this podcast that you did again, since it's fresh in my mind. Everyone go listen to the Miami Review of Comics podcast in general, but also Austin's episode. But you touched on something in there, and I really did it, and that was the idea of works coming in and out of print and how that affects their perception. And I think that with comics, especially because we haven't had the institutional I mean, if you wanted to read a great novel, one, you can probably find a copy for 50 cents somewhere.
Exactly. Yeah.
Two, you can find them in libraries, right? They're just, if you want to read Mark Twain, you're going to be able to read Mark Twain. If you want to read Charles Dickens, even a bad bookstore is going to have that stuff in there, right? Whereas with comics, things that people think are classics, unassailable classics, it's hard to find a lot of this stuff. And that was especially true in 99. It's gotten better, but now even a bunch of this stuff has come back into print and gone right back out. And so I just wanted you to talk maybe a little bit about that. You were talking about Steinberg in particular, but I do think that that concept travels with a lot of these artists, and even contemporary artists. So
it's weird. Yeah, I mean, I think, I actually use that same note about bookstores that you mentioned. It's like, if you want a copy of War and Peace and you want a classic translation of it, you could, anywhere you are in America, you could probably not even going to the library, could probably own it for $2, and there's nothing, there would be nothing lacking in that copy versus maybe a more prestige edition that you'd still have the text, and you could work with that copy of War and Peace and wrestle with it for years and have your relationship with it. And the price of entry is what it should be. It's open to all. And yeah, and if you don't have those $2 to spend on it, it is at the library, and there'd be multiple copies, and I don't think you'd have to wait. And there's not going to be a time in the next, I mean, who knows? Who knows where libraries are going? But in the next 50 years, I think you can, the availability of those works is, I mean, there've been so many editions printed. But there isn't the same readership for comics. So, when those Penguin editions of superhero comics started coming out, I was like, oh, I mean, I'm not again. It's great that that's happening. They did have a higher price point than the normal Penguin books that are coming out, just like novels and stuff. But I also was like, and I know this wouldn't be as lucrative, but and what I like about those Penguin superhero things is that they're readers. They're not just like, they're not starting from like the Golden Age Captain America and, the first appearance, and then doing like 6 volumes of these Penguin Captain Americas. It's like a reader of some of the best material of the classic I mean, did they have Golden Age in the Penguin edition of Captain America?
I honestly don't know.
They edit it. They edit it so that it's a reader. I would like a reader of just a mass edition paperback of Crazy Cat or things like that. I do think that would be, it's weird because there's like that Little Orphan Annie book from the past that you see in bookstores, ARF, the Hard Life of Little Orphan Annie, or I think it has a slightly different title, but that's missing. They messed it up because it's like missing the Sunday strip, so you can't really read it in the right way. But there were in the past these, like, there's the Celebrated Cases of Dick Tracy, and it's like, of the ultimate American classics that had some kind of pop culture relevance to keep them in print. There were these editions that I think have been read in libraries by people for decades and decades that I think were deeply important to them. And now, in a way, we're in this golden age of reprints, but I still think there's something about it's still for the enthusiast. And I guess it has to be for the people publishing this stuff. They must say, no, it has to be this way because we need to do the complete series of this before we do a best of or whatever. But I don't think it results in these works being part of the public conversation. But I don't really know. I mean, I personally like Dover books, They have those Lynn Ward editions, they Franz Masriel, and you can also get very cheap editions of classic literature from Dover. They're not so cleaned up, I don't know what their graphic design team is, but they must be not there. The covers of these books come out, instead of getting a really nice edition of Moby Dick where it has a beautiful commissioned drawing by some popular illustrator, it just got like, I don't know, something they found off of Google image search, but it's the book and it's affordable. It's the text. And I do think it would be nice to exist in our classic material from this country. I don't know. I mean, it's a better time. It's hard to criticize this moment because it is in I mean, the complete libraries of our strips are in libraries. But for a general reader to like say, okay, I want to get into Barnaby, and I'm so grateful that now I'm about to get the last volume of Barnaby. This is so great. But I think for a general reader trying to understand what the hell this thing is, it's like, boy, they're going to start with like, I would like an edited book that's constantly in print. I don't know if the audience exists for that. But there is the book, the Barnaby book that I had for a long time, which is just it's not the full strip. I think that was a good, affordable. There's so many copies of it, and I was able to find it used pretty easily. I do think that contributes to how marginal this stuff remains, how price prohibitive these volumes are, and that they're, I don't think when these people were making these strips, I think they depended on their readers keeping up with it over the years, but I don't know if they thought of their work being experienced as thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. So I don't know. It's a confusing question. I don't know if that answers what you're asking, but I do think there's a different way to approach this classic work being available to people. Of course, it's going to fall out of print if, the IDW Comics Library. I love those books. I tried to get as many of them as possible. I didn't really have the money at the time when they were first coming out, but I'm so glad they exist. But I would have liked IDW, but of course they go out of print, and sometimes they can't finish the project because you start with volume 1 of Little Orphan Annie, and it's like, what, this isn't the prime of the work, and the project's going to lose speed over time. You're just not going to keep people interested in this. And it's a lot of money to ask someone to keep paying before you get to the most beautiful work from one of these authors. So but comic book people love complete, they like number ones, and they like having a complete run. And I'm one of those kinds of people, so I get it. But in terms of it being something that, if you're like with the Tolstoy example, if you're a general Tolstoy reader, you wouldn't go into a bookstore and be like, okay, the early work for $50. Okay, I got that one. The series didn't make it to Anna Karenina. They had to cancel the series before they got that. That just doesn't really make sense, And I think you could make a cheap volume of the best of Crazy Cat that is an Natashan edition or a Sunday Press edition that has the, that Patrick McConnell book. Do you know that one? Like the Art of Drudgery? That's perfect. And I'd like to see that brought back into print. Things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially for library access, right? I'm sure like a lot of kids, that's how I first read Popeye and Dick Tracy. And, these were, and yes, they're usually filled with some junk too, because they're situating as an American icon, whatever. But it also would have samples of where this stuff actually started. There's probably enough Marvel and DC reprints now that a kid probably could find some of the good stuff, but they'd have to wade through a mountain of shit to get to it. I mean, how many bad trades you have to get through before you get to Ditko Spider-Man,
Right.
Whereas,
yeah. That's why if I was to make one of these lists now, I'd put the Smithsonian Bill Blackbird newspaper anthology. If Raw is on this old list, and things that are mainly the project of an editor, if we're going to say Mad 1 through 24, Harvey Kurtzman, I think that Bill Blackbird book is just one of the best statements about cartooning ever. I just think I learned more from the selections in that book. And I've read the Popeye excerpts in that more than I've read the complete library of Popeye I now have, just because it's some of the best stuff from that strip. And I'm so grateful to have it there, and then compare it to, some really choice Harold Gray stories. So I do think something with these projects that are thousands and thousands of pages, some edited versions first might be. I'd like to see that Smithsonian newspaper book come back in print. That'd be a nice one. If New York Review of Comics is listening to this, you guys should do that one.
They should. I mean, somebody just did a spiffy new edition of the Origins of Marvel Comics. I mean, if you can put that out, come on, let's get the Smithsonian book.
I just don't know if the readers that's what's weird. Like, there's been this amazing project since this list came out. of all these out of print strips. And you'd think that would have created a new readership for this stuff. And maybe it has. Maybe if you're in the accounting offices of these companies, you're like, no, we're selling a lot more of, we're the publisher that's working with Little Orphan Annie now. If you look at the numbers when Fantagraphics was doing it, we're selling a lot more. I don't know. But the books seem to dip out of print still. So I don't, it's still tough.
Yeah, I think it's a hard road for anyone to hoe, even with popular strips. I mean, I think even the stuff that's really well regarded, I think it still takes perseverance. The Library of American Comics imprint did a pretty good job, considering, they were just an imprint at a company, and not an artsy company either. I mean, and of course, Fantagraphics is in their own realm of just stick-to-itiveness. They'll just keep going unless it's just financial suicide. They keep trucking along.
I love those single volume essential LOAC, like 1 year of a strip. Those I buy sight unseen. I think those are perfect.
Same here. I wish there had been a lot more of those, and I don't even have all of them. But whenever I find them, I try to get them. You were young when you read the original list, but looking back now, with the accrued wisdom of the last 25 years, and someone who's, thought a lot about comics, and, what would your main critique of that list be?
What
would your main critique be if you had to put your finger on one thing you think was a misstep or a misjudgment?
Now. I
Yeah.
guess I wish I'd thought about this a little bit before, because I feel like I'm going to resort to what everyone says, but I really don't think. I do think the list, I think, withstands because people viewed it as legitimate and it stated its own legitimacy. The one thing when you're really looking through it that makes you uneasy about its legitimacy is all the Hernandez brothers entries. And I say this as a Hernandez brothers fan. Sure. It just seems there's something, I don't know, there's something about that I just don't, I understand it politically. And if you take out the Fantagraphics publishing the Comics Journal part, which I don't, that's meaningless to me. I get the argument. I mean, I think the journal does these things, and this is just based on my own feelings, that it's like, I maybe if you asked Gary and Tom at the time if this is true, I don't know if they'd come out and say it, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but I do think the journal does some of these things as a indirect critique, and I do think that there's something very valuable about that indirect critique, where if our other impoverished critical institutions are going to put 5 different X-Men stories on their list of the greatest comic book stories of all time, okay, we'll show you. Really, we'll show you how wrong that is. Not in terms of it being that you're an idiot. It's just like there's real stories out there. There's classic stories that deal with how people are and what happens to them. And this series has a lot of issues. X-Men has a lot of issues, but there's some really good stories in here about what it means to be a human. And if your guys' lists are gonna, go through, the Savage Land or the Dark Phoenix saga as being different moments, and I'm not saying this is exactly what they're responding to, but a culture of comics that does that. Okay, well, here's our response to that, and I can appreciate it on that level. I do think, I just do think it's hard to, if I'm trying to work on a list of my own, there is so much work that you can't fit. I think that's such a positive thing to say about comics. 300 entries, I wouldn't be able to get at work that I think is, there's people in this that in your interview, Seth is saying he couldn't come up with more than 77 comics. I mean, I feel very differently, and I think there is a kind of 90s alt comics guy thing, and I appreciate it in some ways, where they're like, this is my standard. This is what I think makes good comics. You know, and there's really only 77 people that did that. I don't feel that way. I think there's I have a really hard time. There's so many different strains of cartoonings and modes and rhythms in which it expresses himself that I have a really hard time even limiting myself to like 300 entries or something like that. But if it is 100, I do think you really are wasting, you're doing a disservice to the rest of the list by overpopulating it with, and it's almost like you're making the case for something a little too loudly. And again, I understand the justification. There's lots of beautiful stories in this saga, but it almost like questions it. It like makes you question, if you're irritated by all these entries, you start to be like, you know, I don't know. Maybe this is being rammed down my throat, which it shouldn't have to be. There could just be a Locas Palomar entry, and okay, we get it. You know, I mean, this is, and maybe bump them up a little bit higher.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's the criticism that everyone has. I guess, because it's English language, there's certain things that I think are important that wouldn't have been eligible. I would have tried to open it up to manga, but I understand why that would have been even more infeasible then than it would be today. I guess, and this is just like, I mean, I hate saying this because if someone else was saying it, I'd be so bored by them saying it, but I can't deny that I feel it. Just being all men making the list does, I think if anything we've seen in the last 25 years of comics is that I think the most exciting cartoonists these days tend to be women entering the medium who don't have the obsessive quality that we have, where we just have read everything and we've thought about it, and anything that we do creatively, even if we try to get away from that obsession, is going to be informed by the system that we've either tried to reject or gone along with. I do think, and that's not to say that there aren't women that are as obsessed with comics from a young age as we are, but I do think a lot of the strength of a lot of work from women that enter the medium is that they tend to have less baggage about the history of this work and are able to look at work with a different eye. And just the gender dynamics aside, bringing in people who are experts on art in a different way, who have an understanding of comics, but might not be obsessive connoisseurs. I think that could be valuable. What I was really interested in reading in your magazine was that the journal wanted to express the journal's point of view, and that actually explains a lot. But I do think bringing in some perspectives of just some I would have liked to maybe see, and I don't know if she would have done it, but maybe bring Phoebe Glockner in. If you're going to bring Seth in, maybe bring Alan Kaminsky-Crumb in. She, and again, this is where you're criticizing people. You don't know if they tried to do this or it just was unworkable. But Alan Kaminsky-Crumb, she did a lot of editing. She did a lot of heroic editing. One of the projects that she edited is on the list. So she might have something to say. Maybe someone like Melinda Gebbie. She was around a lot of. Trina Robbins would have been someone interesting. These people that were around that because of who they were in a certain kind of industry are going to see different things and have different perspectives on it. And I know that's a critique that a lot of people would have of this, and I don't mean it in a dismissive way, and I don't even mean it from a political angle. I just think aesthetically, certain people are going to have different opinions and ideas about stuff, and I think the list could have benefited from that.
I agree. I mean, to our 2025 eyes, the list really jumps out to you. And
no one debated it back then. That's the other notable thing.
No. It wasn't even a topic. And, I do think because of the history of comics in North America, it was dominated by straight white men. I mean, I think the demographic wave has been coming for a long way, and the the playing field has leveled quite a bit and will continue to level. And that just means more great work by all kinds of people is being made and will keep getting made. So I think if you were to survey 100 years later, the numbers would be vastly different. But I think a lot of it comes down to just opportunity. I mean, there aren't, a lot of black cartoonists on the list either. I didn't go down the road of trying to break down that demographic because I thought I'll get into a sticky wicket here of trying to assume people's backgrounds, and I just didn't think that was a smart minefield for me to wander into. But outside of George Harriman and what's that?
The number one entry is there's a big gap from the number one entry, who I don't think at the time were people even aware of that aspect of his identity. I mean, I think some people knew. I was not aware.
Yeah. I mean, it's like George Harriman and Kyle Baker. I think that's it, So it's pretty slim. But then you also go look at the rosters at EC and Marvel and DC. And I mean, there weren't, it was a pretty white operation. And so it's hard for people to make great work when they are not getting a job to do or getting hired to do that work.
I think that's kind of where, like, I think Jacob Lawrence's, if you're going to have Al Hirschfeld on there, I think Jacob Lawrence's painting narratives, I think you could make a case for that. If we're going to prize Harvey Kurtzman's satire so high, I think Emory Douglas's Black Panther art, I think, should have a place on there. I mean, these might be things where you're like, well, why would these aren't comics? But I don't think if Steinberg's on the list and Hirschfeld's on the list, I think those, and I don't blame them for not being on the list, but I do think there are some pretty major examples of very deeply affecting sequential artwork from people with identities that are not represented on the list that I don't think you'd even have to, I don't think you'd be making a kind of, I don't think you'd be making an argument based on anything but the work. I think those works are deeply, they're just successful works of art. That it's weird because, like, I think this list, the stuff on this list, I think anyone from any background, despite the balance it has, I think they're inspirational works to anyone from any walk of life who wants to engage in this medium. And I'm not saying that this list is what's inspired the demographic change at all, because I don't think that that's true at all.
No.
But I don't think it's another factor of limiting this medium from different backgrounds of people. I think the art itself is electric. That's represented here, and I think anyone can get something from that. Of course, who am I to say, obviously, but I do think there's something about the artists themselves are should be accessible and discussed and made available to all. And I think any entry on here is a valuable thing to be made available to everyone.
I agree with that. And, obviously the name of my zine is Canon, and Canons have fallen into disrepute at this point. People are actively hostile towards the idea. And my title is a little tongue in cheek. Because often I'm not interested in things I would necessarily promote as the excellence in the form. I'm looking for things that are interesting to me, or little tucked away nuggets. But yeah, I think that the idea of the comics canon isn't established enough to really be too authoritative like it would be in the literary world, But I'm not really interested in tearing down the canon. I just want more things to be let in, I guess.
Canon is always in process. It's always in motion.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't see it as a monolith that is unchanging. Like, oh, we've decided that Lil Abner's on here, so now it's a pristine work that can never be removed. I keep picking on Lil Abner because I'm just not a fan.
That's a good one to pick on.
Yeah. But I'm not criticizing it being on the list. I think I mean, it was a very important strip in its day. But I think it's one that wouldn't make a list like this in the future. I just, and that's, take aside the fact that Al Cap was a bad guy. Like, I mean, just the work itself, people are not engaging with Lil Abner and reading Lil Abner anymore. I just don't think that it speaks to a crowd.
I think there's something, I was just talking about this with someone where it's like, there's work on this list that is racially offensive, and there's European work that's racially offensive, and then but there is in my I think there's an ugliness to Al Cap's worldview that can't that doesn't last. You know what I mean? And then there's something like, there's an ugliness to, for me, there's an ugliness to things that are depicted in Terry and the Pirates, but there's a deeper ugliness to Will Eisner's depiction of Ebony. And I think they reflect different kinds of people at heart. And I do think it infects the whole project. And I think there's something about Al Cap's, the hatefulness that was at core with him, that it seeps into even the casual parts of Little Abner. And I think some things are going to last longer, even if they're infected to a degree with the attitudes of their time. And if those attitudes are just spilling over the entire project, you see it. I think the problems I have with The Spirit, I see the way that Eisner views Ebony, I kind of see it everywhere in the strip, even on non-racial aspects. I see that kind of simplistic worldview, not just me, but whereas with, Terry and the Pirates definitely has its problems, but I see a different, and Milton Caniff is a very different guy than me, and he's probably much more conservative, but I see a different kind of person beyond the depictions of Connie. You know what I mean? And I mean, I think with Al Cap, it's like, I think it's a comic strip that was maybe one of the few comics that my parents were aware of in their youth. And so, it did have this big effect on the, I mean, it's like Al Cap was like, presidents were, speaking with him and stuff. So he's a cultural figure in a way that a lot of other people weren't. So it makes, again, I think the list, we keep going back to this thing where I think the list wanted to express comics as part of a wider part of American culture, which I think the wizards of the day just didn't have any investment in, keeping it more the direct market. That's what comics are. And I think Little Abner points to, well, I mean, there's a big involvement in comics beyond the direct market.
Are you this is a bit of, but are you familiar with the list that the Hooded Utilitarian put together?
Yeah, I contributed to it.
I was wondering.
I don't know. I don't have that list memorized. I do remember it. I do remember being interested in doing it, but there was something about, I just remember it kind of not really taking off in a way. I can't remember it. I in a way, and correct me if I'm wrong, I thought it was going to be like, I was like, oh, this might be like way wilder than the Comics Journalist. But then I remember when I saw the votes come in, it was a bit more staid. Watchmen is like really high on there, which I love Watchmen, but it was sort of like, okay. What were you going to bring up about that?
Well, I guess you mentioned Wizard and things, but not too many people or people, organizations, whatever, have attempted this sort of undertaking, which is surprising, right? Because at the turn of the century, everyone was doing this stuff for everything, and comics people tend to love lists, love arguing about things. We're in the age of the internet where lists are just catnip to get someone to click on it.
We're all on the spectrum too.
Yeah. but the hooded utilitarian list, and I put the URL in
Oh, I
the
have it here. I have it here.
in
Yeah.
Canon. You know, one of the problems with what, you know, if you go and you read their little introductions and stuff, I think it was Robert Stanley Martin is the guy who kind of put everything together and crunched the numbers. And he was really convinced his list was far superior to the journal list because they had everyone contribute a top 10 and they had a lot of people. And then they just sort of blended those together. But you're right. What you got was a flatter list. It wasn't Peanuts, I think, is number one and not Crazy Cat. That already kind of says something right there. And I love Peanuts, but it says something, right?
I know what you mean. Yeah.
And then later on you get stuff, I think, like Why the Last Man is on there. You know, it's like not to shit on Why the Last Man, but you know what I'm trying to say, you know?
Yeah, oh, totally. I mean, yeah, it shouldn't be on there at all.
Yeah.
And Calvin and Hobbes, like, that gets at something to me too. It just, I mean, I guess it just feels very like there is, and I see this quality a lot. I really appreciate Canon for not being this way. I see a lot of criticism these days being very the internet responding to the internet. And I love Calvin and Hobbes, but I know that when this was done in 2012, Calvin and Hobbes was like very blog culture, sort of like kind of being mystified beyond, I think, what Calvin and Hobbes actually contains. And I grew up with Calvin and Hobbes and loved it. But there's something about it that seeing it number 3, it just activates my criticism of it that I haven't even really explained to myself. And so, but I mean, the thing is, I'm looking at it now. It's an interesting, again, if the justification for the comics journalist is this is 100 very good comics, you know, I'm looking at this now and you know what it is? It's the problem of the internet where it's just like, it's just aerial text on a white background and there's no imagery next to it and you have to click it. And I think that just, I don't know, it just makes it harder to, probably if this was presented as a publication and it had some weight to each entry, I'd be able to really immerse myself in it more and think about the choices. Maybe that's just because print still has a influence on me, but I think just looking at this, I just think that's the problem I have with it, honestly. Like, I'm just looking at entries like From Hell being here next to Donald Duck. I think that's, I mean, From Hell, these are all things from the comics journalist. But I kind of can see Robert Stanley Martin's, and I think he's a great comics thinker. I can see him feeling that this is comparable, if not better than the comics journalist. It's just so hard to connect with something. Oh, but they opened it up to manga, and then like the highest manga is at 33. Is that the case?
I believe that's right. Yeah. I mean, there was obviously, you know, the wave of manga has not caught up. You know, I mean, you know, we still have, I don't know, it's impossible to read it all. That's for sure. When I talked to Robert Boyd, he made the point like, yeah, you don't really need the issue because you can find the list online, you know. And I said, well, one, a young person has to know it exists to go find it. You know, I mean, you're not going to go to some random Reddit page to find this list and hear a bunch of people arguing. But I said, what you lose is all of the essays and the imagery. And I think the essays in the original issue are sort of uniformly excellent. They're just nice encapsulations. And then as you get to the larger works, the essays get bigger. But they're all great essays by a wide variety of people. That, you know, as you said, they chose just great cartoons to go along with everything. And I guess the point I was trying to make about bringing up the hooded utilitarian list from a defunct website, you know, was more that they kind of allowed numbers to rule the day. And kind of what I like about that original journal list is how messy, you know, it is. Like, they use numbers, they sort of crunch the numbers, here it is. But then, you know, they said, well, okay, so somebody did a Matt Howarth comic at number 1. That's an outlier. We're not going to put that on the list, even though it would have made it based on points. But they considered that to be kind of beyond the pale. And I guarantee you those guys shuffle things around in the office. I mean, Gary Groth essentially admitted that, yeah, we didn't really feel bad about moving things around. And I feel like Tom Spurgeon's fingerprints.
We should talk about some of this stuff off the record for some,
Sure.
Because I've been thinking about this a lot. I don't know if that Matt Hollingsworth vote for the number one, like putting one of his, what is it, like Pirate Corps or something? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if a number one vote without any other supporting votes, well, it's less people. But in doing the TCJ yearbooks, there will be people that will vote for something at number one. And just by the votes, if there's no one even voting for it again on any other list, when you do a consensus list, sometimes if there's just a number one vote, it's still not enough.
Yeah.
Although I would have to do the math myself. It really does become those mid-level. Like when I was looking at the votes here on the individual list, so few people vote for Crazy Cat as number one, but everyone votes for it somewhere. So that ends up adding up. Yeah, I do. I mean, I think there's a meditative quality to print even before you start reading a print publication. I think the amount of space given to the entries that make it onto the top 10, there's a hypnotic quality to looking at that. Like, and I just don't think, and then you want to sit down and read the justification for why this has so much text and the other ones don't. Even if what needs to be said in 2 pages about this that the other entries don't. And when I see listicles on the internet, even like when they get to the number one entry or whatever, it's just as much text as the number 20 entry, and I just don't. There's something about making the case. It doesn't, and the journal doesn't just pad things out. But if something is the number one thing according to you, you are probably going to have more to say about it than, there's more to say about Crazy Cat than Prince Valiant. And I think the list obviously reflects that. But I do think if this list was in print, and I think I'd spend more time with it. I like the Sight and Sound, that the British film poll, I think is a really good parallel to this. They just redid it recently, and I couldn't get the print issue in time. But if I had it, I'd be looking at it a lot. Sometimes if I'm looking for a movie to watch, I call up the list on the internet, but I don't spend that much time with it, because it's irritating to click around it, and I just don't become that involved in it. But if I had that issue, I'd be looking at it a lot more, and it would seep into my brain a lot more.
I had the exact same experience. I also tried to get it, and it really perplexed me why you wouldn't want to keep something in print that's going to be your bestseller. It doesn't. It just doesn't make any sense. Do you think that with this original issue, just speaking to it, the list having a life, and I think it has a life. It has reverberated, but kind of in a stealthy way, in terms of informing publishing decisions and just a general sort of consensus in a very vague way. But the fact that it was published in a periodical, which means that the next month or two another issue comes out, they're on to something else,
right?
And now you can't really buy the issue. I mean, you can go on eBay and find a copy if you're lucky for like $50, but
it's expensive
or more. Do you think if this had been published as a book or as a standalone, just the list, if that had been published, do you think that it would have had, because I really do think it would have had more legs. I think that it's sort of thing that maybe could have been found in bookstores, found in libraries, whereas the ephemerality of it being in a magazine is part of the appeal, but it also limits what it can do later.
Yeah, I would. I worked in a comic book store, and I did sell copies of some kind of books that were very like the silly books, like 1,000 movies you need to see before you die. But people buy those, and it would be nicer if they were buying something with a little more thought to it. But I don't know if those are the kinds of books that people buy, and that's one of those things where working in bookstores to the degree I have, it's very hard to predict what serious thing people connect with and what, I mean, the like intersection of lists with serious criticism is a hard one to predict how that's going to work out. I do think, yeah, it would be nice. I think if you're going to make a book of it, you'd want some excerpts from some of the strips. You'd want to make a whole thing out of it. But yeah, it would be nice. I just don't. Yeah, I don't know how long it would stay in print, but if you did print it as a book, it would at least be a little more available secondhand than the list itself. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, if it's done again, I think there should be some effort with a bigger bookstore market to maybe do something like that. But I really don't know. I do think more books of Fantagraphics. I think more than anyone, there's some like, there's a big difference between the comic criticism books that come out from university presses, where it's like some very intelligent person explaining to you why Sandman is very important. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Versus the critics that Fantagraphics have, like Bob Levin. Like, I don't know how well Bob Levin's collected book of essays has done, but I have a copy that I look through all the time, and I'm glad it exists. I'm glad I can get all of Bob Levin's incredible essays from the Comics Journal in one volume. I find that valuable, and they're out and about in the world. I don't know how many people are getting them used, but if you are open to the experience of what Bob Levin has to say, that work is available because it's not just strewn through the Comics Journal. There is a collection of it. So yeah, it would be nice. I could see that. I think there's a day where it will be made available in that way, or there'll be some context for it that it's a little more durable than this list. But it is also kind of fun, the sort of like, younger people that are interested in this now, the hunt for that issue and reading, they might take it in a bit more because they had to track it down and see what was being said in 1999.
Very true. The role of the journal. This kind of last thing I'd like to really discuss with you.
Sure.
I think, I think the journal was important to you. It's obviously important to me. There's a certain small group of people for whom the journal has been a through line, and they're always interested in what's going on. And maybe that waxes and wanes for some people. Maybe it was a really big deal for them for 3 years at a certain point, but it had the ability to really, as you kind of said earlier, provide a glimpse into a world where comics are taken seriously. The cartoonist Andrew Neil, he read the Canon issue, the annual, and he said it's fascinating to see these guys taking this stuff so seriously, and people used to wage wars and letter columns, and it was real life and death stuff, and I love all that stuff, but I can't understand why someone who's maybe younger or maybe wasn't around for it sort of rolls their eyes. I guess I just wanted to know, this is a very shaggy non-question, but if you just wanted to maybe talk a little bit about the importance of the journal in its history. I tried to get at it in an essay in the annual. I don't know that I did, but I actually broke it into two separate days because I just kept writing and kept trying to figure out what I was trying to say.
I think to do justice to answering that, and I'm sorry, let me let you finish.
No, that's it. I just, I just like you to expound on the journal and its importance, and as someone who has found it important and important enough to work on it currently, what do you think about its role? For so long it was dismissed as elitist, as haters. They don't want. It's the same shit you hear now about Marvel movies, right? They just don't want let people enjoy things. They don't want people to have fun. Right. That sort of this illiterate take. So anyway, I'm talking. I'd like you to talk.
Yeah, it's like the Comics Journal is the Taliban. They hate freedom. That's where they
That's right.
Well, I think to do justice to what I really feel about the journal in my own life, I'd have to really sit down and write a lot. So this, I'm going to try to abbreviate it as best I can and do justice to the question. But when this last summer, I got up to accept an Eisner for working on the journal, and I did prepare my speech to try to get at what this magazine has meant for me. And I had two versions of what I was going to say, and the first one and I believe in both. The one I said on stage, I was very happy with, and I'll repeat that now. As I was walking off the stage with Gary, I said, Gary, there's this other thing I was going to say, but I didn't want to be too argumentative on stage. And I said what I was going to say to him, and he was like, "Oh, you should have said that." So I'm going to say both things. So the first thing is that, again, for reasons that I think I still need to explain to myself, I do think there is a role that comics can play in people's lives. I think because they are a medium that is very different than painting and film. They are very, they can be a medium for people of all backgrounds and all kinds of economic backgrounds. And that's very important to me. But its importance doesn't lie in a, just a purely political comics about economic situations. That's not so interesting to me. People from different backgrounds that don't necessarily go to MFA painting programs or whatever, being able to express themselves on the level in an experimental way, just with materials that are cheap. I think there's an untapped potential for that. And so that's, I have a lot of feelings about comics that I don't think their effect on culture and what that effect can do in some kind of greater emancipatory project. And this is not what I said on stage, so I'm just prefacing this. I don't think that's really been realized yet. But my feelings about comics have progressed since I was 16. But I had the seeds of them. I think I just posted online like a letter I wrote to Eric Larson in The Savage Dragon when I was 11, and I basically sound then like how I sound now. So I had this, but I was taking whatever my thoughts were and I was concentrating it on the Savage Dragon, whatever my obsessions were. I was like, I need to work it out with these Image comics. There's something expressive here, but and you become very convoluted in that way. So encountering the Comics Journal and what Gary and Spurgeon and later Milo George and Anne Elizabeth Moore did with the magazine as I was reading it, and later as I was a little bit older, Christie's work on it, and really that initial blast of reading it when I was still a teenager, it and I said this on stage, and it's not, I think it doesn't get at everything that Gary did with founding the magazine and maintaining the argumentative style of the beginning and fighting for a certain standard. I have some different ideas than what his standard and what the thing he's fighting for is, but I'm largely in agreement with it, with some key differences here and there. But and again, this doesn't get at the totality of it, but it took a lot of abstract feelings about the potential of the medium, and it congealed them for me and sharpened them and honed them. It honed those thoughts, and it helped hone that project. That's not everything it does, but I think that is important. I think having a project with what you do as an artist, as a critic, as a writer, I think a project is good as long as it's not narrow. I think a project of what you're approaching is good to define for yourself. And the Comics Journal's project of this is a medium that is not a commercial genre medium. It does have that, but that's not its only destiny. We are going to fight a war around that, and we're going to start off fighting the war by critiquing how all this commercial genre stuff is a failure of the medium to just be this. And I think people's attitudes of that have changed, but I think that was a war that needed to be fought at the time. And now by fighting that first battle, we've helped, but it's really the artist, but we've helped create a context where we can publish work that is unapologetically art. Now we can focus on that, and we're going to focus on that as more noteworthy than the commercial genre stuff. I think that project is really did hone a lot of my thoughts, and I have a lot of different ideas than orthodox comics journal thinking from the 80s and 90s, but I'm on the side of the project in general. And I think it being there and it being this concrete thing that argued for this thing with a lot of voices in it, but still basically on the same page, was incredibly valuable in congealing thought into something that can be worked with. So that's one way to answer it. And I said a version of that on stage. What I didn't say was, when I first got into the journal, I would hear, especially when I would go to San Diego, you'd hear the rumblings of, I remember being at San Diego when the journal would win an Eisner Award and I'd be in the audience and I'd hear, my fellow comic book fans be like, oh, those fucking elitists, or like, oh, those snobs, I hate them. And you would hear that all the time. I mean, I remember there was a panel at San Diego where the Comics Journal did this thing where they were going to reveal the 10 enemies of the art form. It's a really kind of interesting panel where they had names, as I remember, they had like names written on pieces of paper and they would hold them up. And I remember being at that panel, but like, again, being next to people in the audience that were really, thought it was gross. And then, I remember the Eisners that year, people were making, I think Scott Shaw made a joke about that panel. And there was kind of this like punchline of the journal of being elitist. And I think what I was going to say on stage is like, okay, yeah, we've all heard the journal's elitist, the journal is this, blah, 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 the journal, blah, blah, blah. But if you walk around San Diego in 2024, look at the fucking commercialism that has stripped that convention bare. Like we all hear the stories. I'd love to have been there where it's like, in the 70s, San Diego, it was Jack Kirby there. He was drawing and it was all about comics and all about, I think people that to different degrees, even if they had a less razor sharp conception of it, believed in comics as having something to do with the artist making it. Now you walk around San Diego and it has been stripped. It's a genre market. That's the best way to describe it. It's just a genre market. Mm-hmm. And who has maintained the argument against that? I think so. What I was going to say is like, you look around San Diego now. I mean, a magazine saying this is an art form. And I think the Eisners in a highly imperfect way wants to believe that, they like, I'm very critical of the Eisners, but I do think the Eisners in 1999 or 1995 or whenever the first one I went to still more or less has the same view of comics as an art form that it does now. It's not perfect, but it has some. They're going for, I mean, it's against the journal's project because they embrace a lot of mediocrity, but they still want, it's like the dark horse maverick standard of the art form. Like I have a lot of affection for Concrete. I understand why Concrete won a lot of Eisners, and I understand why it's not on the top 100 list. Mm-hmm. But the floor of San Diego itself is really, really far away from the Eisner standard of 1995. I mean, it is not really I walked around it this summer. And it's kind of incredible and this kind of like crazy, like, like, oh, maybe I'll get a Tokidoki sample and like, get this, there's just all kinds of toys and stuff. And it's fun in a way, but I mean, it's just all these high-end releases of limited edition genre items for very high prices. In the comic section, the back issue section is not very good. I mean, you can find some stuff there if you want, but it's not. This medium is so vulnerable to people bulldozing it because it doesn't define itself as an art form. It even when it wants to, most of the industry defines itself as being enthralled, just in awe of other media and other media validating it. And the Comics Journal has never been that way. It believes in the medium itself as being just as important, if not more so, than film or anything else. And I don't see that as elitist, especially in comics. It feels like the Comics Journal is more partisan to comics than the people in the audience, or the people in the audience of comics that think of the journal as elitist in an against comics way. I think time has proven its project correct. And what I'd like to say is that it's proven its project like victorious, but I also think that has not happened. I think it's happened in some ways, but I still see, I don't see it as success as being achieved, which, I mean, I don't think any artistic medium that you never see success as the project is never done, but I still think a lot of the same issues remain. But yeah, in terms of that elitist critique, it's really the opposite. I mean, allowing Hollywood to just dominate you. I mean, that's the real elitism, of these things that I do a class at SVA where I devote one class to Jack Kirby. These movie studios, I'd say 22-year-old students now, they know who Stan Lee is. They might not even like these movies anymore, but they do know who Stan Lee is. They do not know who Jack Kirby is, and that is if there's an anti-elitist actor in comics, it's the Comics Journal, because they did as much work as possible to get Jack Kirby's life and words out there. And these movie studios that San Diego has rolled over backwards for, they don't care about Jack Kirby. So, but they're happy to make money off of his creations.
Of course.
So I hope that answers your question.
It does, and that was fantastic. And I think that's a great place to stop it. You've been so generous with your time. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's a blast. It was a blast.
Yeah. Thank you for coming on here and talking about this stuff. Everyone out there, go to dominobooks.org. Go check out the amazing selection. I know Austin doesn't like the term curation for what he carries, but he does select an amazing array of material to carry, including, for some reason, my zine, which you can find there. And
obviously,
go read the journal, go read a new one, go find an old one, go engage with it. Anyone out there, please read the journal in any way you can. Go online and get access to the archives. It's, I don't like reading on a screen either, but it's a great deal. And
and I'll just this is a great. This really is a great publication, and my copy's it's got some coffee stains on it, and I've really been reading it. So
that's great.
Thank you. To hear that. I'm glad to contribute to this conversation.
I appreciate it, Austin. Thank you.
Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.